spotlights. Okay. So our topic this week continues to be the ethics of gray zone operations. Yesterday, using the just war tradition as a departure point, we explored frameworks for assessing justified lethal and sublethal responses in the so-called gray zone. And today and the rest of the week, we'll discuss specific gray zone activities with an eye toward testing and perhaps amending those frameworks. Perhaps we'll obtain what John Rawls called reflective equilibrium, or perhaps not. To initiate this process, we're lucky to have the co-editors of the 2017 book, Soft War, The Ethics of Unarmed Conflict, the first and currently only volume on the topic. Dr. Tami Meisels is a political theorist at Tel Aviv University, and her research and teaching focus on nationalism, territorial rights, terrorism, and warfare ethics. Her two books, Territorial Rights and The Trouble with Terror, Liberty, Security, and the Response to Terrorism, are definitive works on those topics. Dr. Michael Gross is a political ethicist at the University of Haifa, focusing on the ethics of conflict. His highly recommended monographs include Moral Dilemmas of Modern War, Torture, Assassination, and Blackmail in an Age of Asymmetric Conflict, and The Ethics of Insurgency, a critical guide to just guerrilla warfare. And his just released book is Military Medical Ethics in Contemporary Armed Conflict, Mobilizing Medicine in the Pursuit of Just War. So as usual to the attendees, please send me your questions as they occur to you during the presentations via the chat function. And for the midshipmen, please preface your question with MIDN. So Tami and Michael, thanks to both of you for working late. And Tami, you have our full attention.
Thank you. Is it okay if I share slides?
Yes, yeah, let me make you a co-host.
I think it's okay. I think I can do it. Can you see them now?
Yes,
okay.
Got them.
Wonderful. So first of all, thank you, Ed, for inviting me. As Ed said, the work that Michael and I are going to present comes from our joint edited volume, Soft War. And the idea of soft war, at least as I saw it, was to include military tactics short of killing. And my topic was wartime imprisonment, which is not a soft tactic. It's probably at the hardest edge of our non-kinetic topics. And what intrigued me, especially in view of several Israeli cases, was that armies take prisoners in war and they're authorized to incarcerate, they're required to offer a quarter. And at the same time, sub-state organizations that respond in kind are widely condemned as kidnappers, hostage takers, and so forth. George Fletcher puts this very well in his book, Romantics at War. He says, terrorists don't take prisoners, they take hostages whom they're prepared to mistreat for their own purposes. And the recent cases that I have here on the slide come to mind, specifically Gilad Shalit. I think that was pretty well publicized worldwide. Gilad Shalit was captured by Hamas in 2006, and he was ultimately exchanged for 1,024 Palestinian security prisoners held in Israel. And the question that was being asked both in the Israeli press and to some extent on my Facebook page and was, are these people prisoners of war because they're soldiers? Two other cases. There was another case of a lieutenant who was dragged into the Hamas tunnels, though he was killed very quickly in Israel's attempt to stop the kidnapping. And there have been other cases. Are these people prisoners of war or are they hostages? Should we condemn terrorists for taking prisoners? I argue that we should. Just to give it a different kind of case, in 1947, Mandatory Palestine, the Irgun, a Jewish underground movement, captured 2 British sergeants in response to the British having apprehended 2 of the Irgun members who later went to the gallows. The Irgun held these prisoners in rather harsh conditions, and ultimately, when their members went to the British gallows, they hanged the two hostages in a field in Netanya in Israel. And then they publish a statement that says, we recognize no one-sided laws of war. In other words, if the British are going to take our men and imprison them and hang them, then we're going to take British soldiers and imprison them and hang them. And this raises the question, really, what is the difference? Why the one-sidedness? Why the double standard? Why enable armies to take prisoners and regard Hamas or whoever as kidnappers or hostage takers? I definitely think we should uphold this double standard and we should make the distinction. And my answer for why, I don't know how much I'm going to be able to go into all the details, is basically twofold. First of all, it concerns the status of the captors of the organizations doing the imprisoning. Second of all, it concerns the purpose of captivity. Why are they being held? These are the two British sergeants who were held by the Irgun, and they're hanging in 1947. So I want to start at the very beginning, and I gather from Ed that you've been discussing just war theory. So my starting point is that in the absence of special qualification in the normal course of events, individuals are prohibited from capturing anyone at all, right? We can't incarcerate each other. It would be false arrest. Walter says as much. To begin with, we're all immune from attack. And the laws of armed conflict introduce an exception. They grant immunity from prosecution to combatants. As long as these combatants, well, I mean, I think everybody here knows this, or as long as those combatants qualify as lawful combatants, which most irregulars do not. In order to qualify as a combatant, in order to be entitled to prisoner of war status, in order to be immune from prosecution for acts of war, militants have to wear uniforms or identifying badges or caps that can be identifiable at a distance. They have to carry their arms openly and belong to a chain of command within an organization that abides by the laws of war. Insurgents don't usually abide by all these criteria. And this includes guerrillas, just guerrilla warriors, as I think Michael refers to them, just insurgencies, underground movements like the Irgun, partisans against the Nazis, and so forth. And there's some qualifications. Militants, since World War II, militants who do wear a uniform and who do carry their arms openly are entitled to some of these rights. Since 1977, Protocol 1, the uniform requirement has been loosened, but still, the idea that soldiers or fighters have to distinguish themselves clearly from the civilian population in order to qualify for the war rights of soldiers. Why maintain the double standard? Why recognize prisoner of war status? Why recognize the rights of armies to take prisoners of war and not accord insurgents prisoner of war status if they're captured, not grant them the right to take prisoners? Then the standard answer of why we discriminate between regular, let's say regular combatants or lawful combatants and irregulars is first of all that irregular insurgents who don't fight overtly, who don't wear uniform, who don't carry their arms openly, place civilians at risk. Even if they themselves don't kill civilians, which terrorists often do, they draw the enemy army into the civilian population. They blur the distinction between soldiers and civilians. The second reason why we don't accord insurgents the war rights of soldiers is reciprocity. Irregulars who don't abide by the laws of war are unentitled to the protections of the laws of war. That said, unlawful combat is not necessarily a war crime. Well, this is just more detailed from what I just said, right? The obligation to fight overtly, to fight openly, to distinguish yourself, to separate yourself from the civilian population is intrinsically tied to the protection of non-combatants. And this the protection of civilians, of non-combatants, including prisoners, the wounded, and so forth, forms the cornerstone of the law and morality of war. Unlawful combatants, I don't like calling them unlawful combatants because there's no such international category that there is an American category, but irregulars, some of whom are going to be fighting for just causes. Nevertheless, they don't deserve the status and immunities granted to soldiers. They can't imprison with impunity. This means that if Israel catches Hamas members who were involved in holding Gilad Shalit, those Hamas members are not POWs. They can be interrogated, they can be prosecuted and put on trial. And at the same time, their act of capturing Gilad Shalit or whoever, as I understand it, is not necessarily a war crime. In other words, there's no international jurisdiction, but Israel under domestic law can try them as criminals. All right, now all of this can seem very unfair because, and I think Michael thinks that some were thought at the time that a lot of what I was writing was a bit unfair and state bias and Israel bias and so forth, because if we put legalities aside, armies very often treat their prisoners badly. Sometimes they, insurgents have just causes. They fight, I'm quoting from Protocol 1, sometimes against colonial domination, alien occupation, or racist regimes. So why uphold this double standard that so clearly prefers armies to insurgents, regardless of cause? It seems unfair if we have the same practice of imprisonment, wartime imprisonment, and we say, if it's performed by states, it's okay, it's legitimate. If it's performed by insurgents, it's not. And I think that despite the fact that it seems unfair, this idea that some practices or enterprises depend on the agent performing them is a concept that's not alien to, at least to lawyers. And I'm relying here a little bit on the work of my colleague, Alon Harel, and his book, Why Law Matters. And Harel writes that, he writes a lot about agent-dependent practices, and his paradigm is the criminal justice system. If an individual performs an act of punishment, it's not only that it's not lawful, it's not an act of punishment, it's an act of revenge, it's an act of vigilantism or whatever, but it's not an act of punishment. Even if he performs his punishment better than the criminal justice system, even if he punishes in a more just and humane way, still the overall goods that are secured, like law and order, by a criminal justice system can't be secured by individuals. And I make a similar argument about wartime imprisonment, that it's an agent-dependent practice, that the goods that are provided by the laws of armed conflict, by humanitarian law, the goods of protecting non-combatants, both civilians and POWs, can only be served by identified combatants fighting overtly, forming part of a chain of command within a law-abiding organization. The same goods, the same protection of non-combatants can't be provided by sub-state, informal paramilitary organizations that fight in a way that blurs the distinction between civilians and combatants. And all of this justifies the fact that the law doesn't grant insurgents the same rights that it grants soldiers. Why? So I've talked a little bit about why fighting overtly is important, because it serves to separate civilians from combatants. But why is command responsibility so important? Why is that specified as a condition for POW rights? And one reason is that armies are the type of organizations that are capable of applying the laws of war, whereas paramilitary organizations sometimes can't enforce the laws of war, even if they want to. And one example comes from the FLN in Algiers. Now, granted, the French were particularly cruel towards their prisoners. They tortured them, right? I can't say a lot in favor of the French in Algiers. But at the same time, there was a problem in granting the FLN, or there would have been a problem in granting the FLN the same war rights of soldiers that French soldiers enjoyed. And one reason is that they weren't capable of, or they seem to not have been capable of enforcing the laws of war. Apparently, there were guidelines requiring fighters to offer quarter, to take prisoners rather than killing them. But at the same time, the FLN didn't have the power to enforce this view on the combatants. And this is part of the problem with granting informal organizations the right to take prisoners. All right, so Michael and I argued a lot about this. Michael's argument, if I understand it, and Michael's here to defend himself, is that he readily admits that most guerrillas are incapable of holding POWs lawfully. They don't have the infrastructure for it. They've got to be on the move. They can't enable third-party visits because then the army will come in and release their hostage. But that maybe we should try and adjust our laws of war in order to accommodate just insurgents, rather than automatically disqualifying them as people who can hold prisoners. And I don't agree with this. I think the laws of war in this are just right for some of the reasons that I've been talking about. I think the double standard is fair. It's not a state bias, that wartime imprisonment is a typical age-independent practice, and that the success of this whole enterprise of wartime imprisonment depends entirely on the performing agents. Therefore, insurgents are rightly denied the immunities from prosecution for committing acts of war, most definitely including the capture of combatants. They can't provide the goods that the laws of armed conflict guarantee or strive to guarantee. And all of this has to do with the first part of the reason that I think insurgents should not be allowed to take prisoners, or shouldn't have the immunities. It's not that they're going to follow what we allow or don't allow, but they shouldn't have the immunities for prosecution for taking prisoners or for other acts of war. The first reason has to do with the fact that they're insurgents and everything that's been said so far. But then there's a second reason that has nothing to do with their status and actually has to do with the nature of the imprisonment, of their imprisonment. And this has to do with hostage taking. It's not just that armies and insurgents perform the same act of imprisonment, and because armies are armies and they wear uniform and they carry their arms openly and they have a chain of command and so forth, they should be allowed to take prisoners, whereas insurgent groups, because they fight covertly, because they blur the distinction between civilians and combatants, because they lure the army to fight among civilians, they shouldn't have the right to take prisoners. That's the first reason. But the second reason has to do with what they're doing. So far, we've been talking about it as if armies and insurgents perform the same act, and insurgents are simply discriminated against because they're not armies. But in fact, they're not performing the same act. It just seems that way. Armies take prisoners in war in order to disable a threat. The basic just war theory justification, the justification that Walzer gives for killing in war, is disabling a threat, self-defense. If you can disable the threat by capturing him instead of killing him, that's certainly better. But insurgents take hostages for a different reason. They don't really have the capability of disabling that many threatening agents in the opposing army. They take an individual hostage, or sometimes several hostages, whom they use to vie for the release of their comrades. Now, hostage taking, unlike the prisoner of war regime, is absolutely unequivocally prohibited by international law. Why? So the ICRC's explanation for why hostage taking is prohibited is that it's an arbitrary use of human beings. And there are a lot of legal prohibitions on hostage taking that I'm referring to Article 34 of the Geneva Convention. And hostage taking is a war crime. It's not just a lack of status. And again, the explanation is that even in the face of military considerations, the natural right of man not to be subjected to arbitrary treatment. And here, I mean, Michael really made this article for me because he kept posing objections that I had to answer. And here, if I recall, Michael said that, sure, taking a civilian hostage, a child or whatever, is arbitrary treatment, but capturing a soldier is not arbitrary. If Gilad Shalit was in his tank, then capturing him is no more arbitrary than capturing a soldier in battle. So why does the International Committee of the Red Cross consider hostage taking of soldiers as well as civilians as arbitrary? And I think the reason is what they mean by arbitrary. So while Michael is right that both insurgents and armies take prisoners in order to gain military advantage, I think there is a difference. Granted, capturing military personnel isn't illogical or random or irrational. It's not arbitrary in that sense, but it is arbitrary treatment in the sense that it uses a human being. It uses the hostage as a means only in the Kantian sense. It uses the hostage as a mere means, as a pawn, as a bargaining chip, not as an end in himself. Unlike the prisoner of war regime, where prisoners of war have rights, they have quite an elaborate package of rights. Hostages have no rights within the regime that restricts their liberty. They're totally at the mercy of their captor's will. They're a mere pawn, a puppet in their captor's plans, right? They're just being used. And this is something that I think hostage taking shares with terrorism more generally. I also think it shares it with torture, which is that no objective justification can be offered to the victim for this type of total deprivation of his most basic rights. There's nothing reciprocal going on here. He's not part of the plan. He's not a rights holder. He plays no part in his captor's calculations. He's a pawn. Now, is this true or is this too easy? So some of my European colleagues posed the following challenge. If there's a just insurgency, if Israel is wrong, if the United States is wrongfully engaged in all kinds of wars, right? Maybe capturing a soldier is a form of self-defense. And when we defend ourselves against a culpable aggressor, we're not using the attacker as a means, right? If someone attacks me in a dark alley and I push them and break their arm, I'm not using the attacker as a means. I'm defending myself. So maybe when Hamas took Gilad Shalit, this is Gilad Shalit here and Lieutenant Hadar Goldin. So when Hamas captures these Israeli soldiers, maybe they're acting in self-defense. And if you're acting in self-defense, just the way soldiers act in self-defense when they kill other soldiers or apprehend them, then you're not using the person as a means. Is that true? So I have two answers here. First of all, there's the whole issue of just cause. Who's to say who's the aggressor and who's the defender? But I'm willing to put that aside. I think analogies between kidnapping unjust soldiers or aggressive soldiers or soldiers on the aggressive side and self-defense are implausible. Because in self-defense, your best self-defense is if the attacker isn't there. What you really want in self-defense is you want your attacker not to be there to begin with. You want to walk down the dark alley and not to be attacked. Whereas in hostage taking or kidnapping, the kidnappers desire the presence of their hostage to use as a means. And here we have Gilad Shalit reading, the paper with the data on it. It's for Hamas to show Israel that he's still there, that there's still someone to bargain with or to bargain over. So I really think that price tagging a person and bargaining techniques are inconsistent with the attribution of inherent value or intrinsic value to human beings, treating human beings as ends in themselves, whether they're civilians or soldiers. And this basically is my twofold answer. which is why we shouldn't enable terrorists or militants or guerrillas or insurgents to take prisoners, while we do enable armies to do that. One part of the answer concerns their status. They're being unlawful combatants or irregulars, which is a term I think is more neutral. Another part of the answer is that hostage taking and kidnapping is very, very different in its essence and in its purpose and its motivation than taking prisoners in war. So I don't think there's a double standard involved in upholding a reciprocal prisoner of war regime for states and their armies, while at the same time totally prohibiting and denouncing the kidnapping of soldiers by sub-state military organizations. I think that people who are taken by these organizations are hostages. They're not prisoners of war, even though they should be entitled to prisoner of war status because they themselves are soldiers. And I don't think there's any inconsistency in prohibiting that. I actually think I've managed to say all of that in 20 minutes, which is what I promised Ed I would do. So that's about it.
Thanks, Tami. That was perfect. This is really clear too. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Okay.
I'm still, maybe Michael still doesn't agree with you, but we'll see.
I think I may have managed to convince him a little bit.
Okay.
Michael? Michael
Yes.
can speak for himself.
No, it's fine.
Okay.
We'll, to be continued.
Well, let me play around with my computer here. Okay, I'm going to remove Tami. Sorry.
Oh, very good.
Okay. And add spotlight. Okay, so Michael, do you want to say a few preliminary words before your video?
No, I just would explain to people that I was I had some shoulder surgery a week and a half ago, so I prepared I pre-recorded a lecture that Ed is going to play. There's some video clips inside. If you can't hear them, you may have to turn up the volume a little bit because of the different systems perhaps that I was using. But I'm going to be speaking about media warfare and manipulation of the media, fake news. And Ed, I think you can go ahead and show it, and then we'll take questions afterwards.
Sounds good. Okay, let me once again play with my computer. This might take me a couple seconds here. Okay. Okay, so Tami, what do you see? Do you see?
I see Michael in one corner. I see you, and I see an X on the screen.
Okay, it's a good start. I'm going to reduce all that and then start the video. Oh,
Okay.
that's not a good sign. Okay.
Maybe Michael should show it the way I showed the slides.
I tested it earlier and it worked.
I'm sure it will.
For some reason, Michael is very large right now. And I want to make him small. That maybe that's it right there. Remove spotlight.
Okay.
Okay, then I'll remove my spotlight. Let me see if I can make that work again.
I think maybe.
It's still showing an X. That's too bad because we tested this. Okay, let me find. I'm going to close down something.
Or we'll just force Michael to speak.
Yes. Okay, I'm going to refresh this. Okay, I think that'll work now. Okay. Share the screen. Okay, I think that's going to work.
Ah, yes, there it is.
Got it.
Sound. I think sound is an issue.
No sound, Ed?
Hmm. So can you not hear the video?
I cannot hear it.
Hmm.
Well, you got it on mute though. You're muted.
I'm mute. How did I become muted? Okay, let's see. So you did not hear any of that?
No, did you?
Yeah, I did. Yeah, I've heard a whole minute of it. Okay, but you can hear me now, right?
Right.
Obvious.
Might be on your output.
Oh, okay. Well, when we tested this before, it worked fine. Let me.
All right. If it doesn't work, I'll go live. I mean.
Okay, I think you muted the shared screen. Okay, exactly what does that mean? Let me try one more time. Okay. Could you hear that now?
No.
No, that's strange. Okay. What I'll do is I'll just go back into the email and
It may be in your output. This is the problem I had when I tried to connect to a video clip while I was recording.
Yeah, but I did test it this morning and it worked.
You heard it, but other people didn't hear it maybe.
No, I tested it with other people.
Oh yeah?
Yeah, it worked fine. Let me just find your link again. Okay, there it is. Okay, let me try it again to share it. Okay, there. All right, can you hear it now? Let's see. Is the sound working now?
No, I can't hear it. You can ask others.
Okay. Well, if there's anybody here with the technical.
Let me just go live. That is probably easier if I just do it live.
Okay.
I'll do it again. It'll be better the second time.
Okay. Thanks, Michael.
I just may have trouble with one of the video clips. We'll see how that works out.
Okay.
Okay, let me turn on my video. Let me share my screen. And I'll try to, okay, now you guys can see my screen, right?
Got it, yeah.
You see my screen or do you see the Milky Way?
I see the Milky Way now. I did see the screen.
Oh, hold on a second.
There, that's
okay.
good.
Okay. Okay. This will be better than the other time around. Tami already mentioned that we're working off of our book, Soft War. In that book, we had a couple of several different topics that I think fit what your definition of gray zone warfare has been. We talked about cyber warfare, media warfare, economic warfare, sanctions, blockades, lawfare, nonviolent resistance, coercive diplomacy, and prisoners and hostages. Prisoners and hostages, of course, is what you just heard from Tami. And I'm going to speak a little bit about media warfare. This is distinct, I think, from a lecture you have later on in the week where you're going to be talking about information warfare. Here I'm talking about the use of media. The examples I'm going to give are by non-state organizations, armed groups, insurgents, who manipulate the media, who fabricate information, who lie, all for the purpose of promoting a particular political agenda. So the question I'm going to raise is about whether, in fact, truth is the first casualty of war, and does it really matter? So the expression, as far as I've been able to determine, that truth is the first casualty of war comes from an 18th century article by Samuel Johnson, where he wrote, among the calamities of war may be jointly numbered the diminution of the love of truth by the falsehood which interest dictates and credulity encourages. Translation, truth is the first casualty of war. But another way of looking at that is entirely morally neutral. So rather than be concerned with the truth per se, propaganda, and here we're looking at the word propaganda. This is 1927. Harold Lasswell was a political psychologist who studied propaganda now almost 100 years ago. And his definition or challenge of propaganda was put in a morally neutral way where he spoke only of the purpose, not so much the content of propaganda. So in his opinion, the problem of the propagandist, or the challenge facing the propagandist, is to intensify attitudes favorable to his purpose, reverse attitudes hostile to it, and to attract the indifferent, or at worst to prevent them from assuming a hostile bent. So he says nothing about the truth. He's talking about using information for a political purpose. And what I'd like to do over the next few minutes is present 3 cases where the truth, whatever that means, was clearly manipulated for political purposes. And then I want to look at maybe some of the moral criteria that are going to help us judge whether in fact this bothers us, whether it should bother us, whether it's legitimate in some circumstances, and what, if any, principles or criteria could help us to judge whether certain instances of bending the truth, of fabricating the truth, fabricating information is legitimate or not. 2 of these draw from the Arab-Israeli, Arab-Palestinian conflict, and one draws from ISIS. I want to go back to Gaza 2000 in what became known as the Al-Dura incident. The Al-Dura incident, you'll see the clip in a moment. It's one that many of you will recognize. It was a film clip of a small boy who was killed in crossfire when Israeli troops fought militants in Gaza back in 2000. It's widely credited with being the trigger for the second Intifada, the second Palestinian uprising. And what you'll see in the report I'm going to show you, and hopefully hear it as well, is a report by The Guardian that came out a few years later after Israel investigated the event and determined that it was staged, that it never took place, that the boy never died, it was a complete fabrication. So I want to use that to set the stage, first of all, to show you an instance of a very powerful media image, a very powerful media image that was used for political purposes, and one where most people didn't and don't accept the Israeli version, but there were reports later on that the video clip that you're going to see was fabricated. And my argument is going to be very simply, doesn't matter. I don't care whether it was fabricated or not. The issue is, what was it used for and how was it used? So I'm going to try to play this. The problem is I've got to change the audio output, and I got to see if I can do that without messing everything else up. So let me see if I can do this. Okay, let's see if this is going to work.
Thinking.
Okay, I got to move this. All right, one second, I just got to move this to a different screen. Okay, can you see this?
Yep, we can see it.
Can you hear it?
Yeah.
The detailed Israeli response to an issue which has always been hotly contested, very much in the center of the propaganda battle waged over the Israeli-Palestinian.
Well, it looks like the screen is frozen though on the YouTube.
Okay, hold on a second.
It's kind of a, there it is. There it is.
Now.
Yeah,
All right,
good.
If you could turn it up, that'd be great too.
Yeah.
The importance of this report is that it's a detailed Israeli response to an issue which has always been contested, very much in the center of the propaganda battle waged over the Israeli-Palestinian dispute. This official finding goes against the report by a French television channel that this Palestinian boy, Mohammed Abdullah, was killed by Israeli gunfire. The report that's been published today says there's no evidence that this was the case, and says that the incident has become part of a poisonous blood libel, as it puts it, against the state of Israel. The father of the boy who was killed, Mohammed, has immediately challenged the findings of the report, and as has the French television channel, the journalist involved who says that he was never consulted by this Israeli investigation. So it remains a highly controversial issue, with both sides standing their ground and tussling over what has become a very, very famous image of the dark days of the Second Palestinian Uprising against Israel in September 2000. Clearly, this is an Israeli government report, and that has already been commented on since it came out, that there appears to be an attempt here by the Israeli authorities to exonerate the Israeli government from any responsibility. Of course, there is a lot of evidence to the contrary. The evidence, of course, is also contested, but the most eloquent response perhaps comes from people who say, well, if Mohammed Abdullah wasn't killed, where is he? And his father points out the boy is buried in the martyrs section, as it's called, of the Burej refugee camp in Gaza. So,
okay, let me go back to my. Okay, you've got this, right?
Perfect.
Okay, I just have to. Okay, I can hear you kind of. 1 second, let me just fix my earphones a second.
Test 1, 2, 3.
Okay, I'm good. Okay,
Good.
so that's one incident. And again, what interests me here is not the controversy over whether it was true or not. What interests me, what's going to interest me, is how it was used and for what purpose it was used. And instead, the entire controversy was waged over, was it true, wasn't it true, did they lie, didn't they lie? Let me give you another example. Jenin, 2002. This was, these images that you see were prompted by an Israeli assault on the refugee camp in Jenin at the height of the second Palestinian uprising. Israeli tanks entered the refugee camp, fierce battle ensued. On April 7th, Saib Erekat, a PA official of the Palestinian Authority, suggested to CNN that some 500 Palestinians had been killed in the camp. PA Secretary Ramin told UPI that the number was in the thousands. April 15th, the United Nations Human Rights Commission condemned mass killings of Palestinians and demanded the end of acts of mass killings perpetrated by the Israeli occupying authorities. That was the narrative. That was the narrative that was set. That was the narrative that led the news. That's the same narrative you can still find today in movies and clips on the internet. It didn't matter that by July 31st, the UN investigation determined that 52 Palestinians had been killed, most of them armed Palestinians, most of them armed members of militias or militant groups. Half of them may have been civilians, while a total of 23 Israelis died in the fighting. So you had a situation of very fierce fighting. You had maybe a kind of balanced outcome here in terms of a fierce battle. But the narrative had been set early in the fighting, April 7th, April 15th. That's what stuck. And the third image that I want to put up, I'm not going to give you any more than this. Most of you know about ISIS executions in Iraq. This was a still shot of what was to follow as an execution. What's interesting about this is this was true. In other words, there's nothing fabricated here. This was an execution that was then broadcast and used for propaganda purposes. So what we have here are 2 or 3 different examples where some are true, some aren't true, some may be true, and our evaluation of what's legitimate and not legitimate, in my opinion, is not determined by the truth or untruth of the clip or of the picture, but of how it was used. So what I want to argue is that in the Al-Dura killing, It may have been impermissible if it was fabricated, and it may have been permissible if it was truthful. It's going to depend on how it was used. I'll explain that in a moment. Jenin 2002, this strikes me as a permissible fabrication, even though it clearly was fabricated. And ISIS strikes me as an impermissible propaganda, even though it was truthful. So what we've done here is try to juxtapose permissibility and truthfulness. So I just want to, in the closing minutes that I have here, offer some guidelines for how we make or try to make these determinations. Let's start with international law. There's very little in international law about propaganda, certainly nothing in the law of armed conflict, because propaganda is not considered armed conflict. It's not considered the use of force, so it's not going to be covered there. But buried in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights is an article that prohibits war propaganda. And war propaganda is or can be interpreted to mean incitement. In other words, propaganda to incite wars of aggression or unjust wars. Aggression, by the definition that appears in the Rome Statute, is the use of armed force by a state against the sovereignty, territorial integrity, or political independence of another state. In other words, what we generally understand to be aggression. So when propaganda is used to incite aggression, this covenant prohibits it, and it also prohibits any advocacy of national, racial, or religious hatred that constitutes incitement to discrimination, hostility, or violence. And there I would add terrorism. So briefly put, propaganda, whether it's true propaganda, in other words, what we sometimes call white propaganda, which is entirely true, or black propaganda, which is entirely false, or gray propaganda, which is a mix of truth and falsehoods, whether there's any of these forms of propaganda, the limiting factor is going to be how it's used. If any of these forms of propaganda are used to incite aggression or incite terrorism, then they fall before this prohibition. And that makes sense. But again, the emphasis here is not on the content, but on its use. So if we were to try and lay out the various moral criteria that we're going to use to judge the use of propaganda, and here I'm using propaganda in the way Lasswell used it, morally neutral to the truth and only sensitive to the way it's being used. Well, we start off with the right to information. And here I would draw a distinction between compatriots and the enemy. Compatriots, country goes to war, compatriots have a right to information. That's what they need to evaluate the war they fight in. That's what they need to judge their leaders' decision-making. That's what they need to judge the progress of the war and the money and the material and the blood that they're asked to supply to wage war. So compatriots need information. Now we know during war there's censorship, and this is common. Information is withheld. Information is sometimes manipulated, but we assume, if not demand, that somewhere along the line, when feasible, this information is going to be forthcoming. In contrast, I don't see why the enemy has any right to accurate information at all. In contrast to that, we look at the perpetrators. This gets kind of back to what Tami was talking about earlier. I think when I wrote the Ethics of Insurgency, Tami looked at it and just said, no, there is no ethics to insurgency. And so if I'm going to suggest here that perpetrators, that those who pursue self-defense have the right to manipulate information and fabricate information as a necessary and least cost, at least violent means, most cost-effective and least violent means to achieve their aim. I mean, if a non-state or even a state goes to war and we accord them the use of force, lethal force, subject to the laws of armed conflict, then it certainly seems right to permit, if not demand, that if less violent means are available to them to achieve their aims, and those less violent effective means are lying, then it certainly seems to me that that's preferable to the use of terrorism or armed force. So I would suggest that the right to use propaganda, as I've defined it, is a right inherent in the right of self-defense. Apart from that, we can look at costs and benefits. So certainly there are costs to lying. One of them, or costs to fabricating information. One of them is what we just noted, incitement to terror. So if we return to the Al-Dura tape clip that was played over and over again in the early days of the second Palestinian uprising, and was used, may have even triggered the uprising, and certainly seems to have been used to incite terrorism against civilians, then this would be a cost of lying and a violation of rights that would be impermissible and reinforce the prohibition of not being able to use propaganda for the purposes of not in this case self-defense, but for the purposes of inciting terrorism or inciting aggression. One of the costs, another cost of lying is that of compatriots. I mentioned that earlier. Compatriots need sufficient information to assess war conduct, but I assume and would demand that this comes along sooner or later down the line. And some people have argued that lying affects the chances of peace post-war. Maybe. I've never seen any proof that this is true, but it just seems to me that after years of killing, destruction, murder, massacre, lying to your enemy is going to be the least offensive action that one party takes against the other. So there are costs to lying. Some of them are overwhelming. Some of them would prohibit the use of propaganda, but in many cases it would not. And then of course there's benefits of fabricating the truth. As we saw from the Jenin episode, it solidifies world opinion, it can lead to enemy demoralization, and it can lead to or reinforce domestic mobilization. So if I go back briefly to the cases that I mentioned earlier, the Al-Dura killing, it really doesn't matter whether it was fabricated or truthful. If it was used to precipitate and incite terrorism, then it falls before the prohibition on the use of propaganda during war. If it's used to publicize grievances or publicize war crimes or publicize acts which were thought to be unlawful, then it's a permissible use of propaganda. Jenin, I think the outcome speaks for itself. There was a great strategic and tactical benefit that was gained through the fabrication of information during the Israeli incursion in Jenin 2002. It was fabricated, but I don't see why it wouldn't be permissible. ISIS, it's the opposite. It's impermissible for two reasons. Number one, these videotapes were used to demoralize troops, to incite terrorism, to terrorize soldiers and civilians. But more importantly than that, they were produced in ways that violated human rights in the most basic way, through the murder of captives. So again, what's important here is not whether it's truthful or not. The important thing is how they were used, for what purpose they were used, and in the case of ISIS, how the material was produced. So with that, I will conclude, and we can, I guess, open it to questions and comment.
Thank you, Michael. That was also very clear.
Oh, let me turn off share screen. Okay.
Okay. Got a spotlight. Got a spotlight. Okay, we all are. A variety of questions. I tend to give the midshipman first dibs. Here's a question from Midshipman Waranimi, which is a question to Dr. Meisels, and it's on Russia's little green men. So they used them during the annexation of Crimea, and they were unidentified soldiers in unmarked uniforms. Should these kinds of soldiers be granted the immunity of nation-state militaries or be treated as insurgents under the laws of war? or some other way? It looks like your mic is muted right now.
Okay, so definitely a fascinating question. I'm not sure I have an accurate answer to, but can you describe the beginning of the question again?
Sure. With these little green men in the Crimea, unidentified soldiers in unmarked uniforms is one way to describe them. Should they be granted the immunity of nation-state militaries or be treated as insurgents under the laws of war, or differently? Is there a third option?
Right. So but my problem is understanding what unmarked soldiers mean. Are they wearing uniforms that distinguish them from civilians?
Well, as I recall, and somebody can correct me, they were in uniforms, but they were unmarked, and they were carrying arms openly too, as I recall.
Yeah. So my understanding from what you read to me is, yes, I would consider them prisoners of war. On the other hand, clandestine Israeli undercover special forces that go into Hamas in disguise don't have the status of combatants. They're irregulars. So if they're captured, they don't have a right to POWs. But if they're in uniform, then I would say yes. Okay.
Yeah, and that dovetails into Midshipman Tanaka's question, which would be covert operators, clandestine operators who aren't military members, how should they be considered? Probably the same, right?
Right. So if I can answer, this isn't really, it's not like it's my opinion. It's accepted that spies and saboteurs, for example, everybody has spies, but spies don't have the status of combatants. So if you catch an enemy spy, right? So you can try him and sentence him and so forth. So it's the same.
Okay, good. And then a question also from Midshipman Warnimi for Dr. Gross. How would you handle social media information campaigns between strategic competitors that promote widespread false information whose goal is to weaken the internal political and social cohesion of the other nation? Would you consider this permissible or impermissible?
Oh, great question. Well, it gets down to the idea of the goal. I mean, I think part of the problem is that my own feeling is, and actually my colleagues and I have studied these kind of cyber attacks, because very often they're perpetrated by cyber means or through social media, and where the intent is to attack the foundations of a society, to attack the foundations of civil society, then to my mind that's akin to terrorism. In other words, these are attacks that are directed at civilians, at civilian infrastructures, at the very fabric of civil society. So, and even though these attacks are non-lethal, I mean, all these media issues may incite to violence, but these don't necessarily have to incite to violence. So it's not only about inciting to violence. There are other forms of terrorism that reach beyond kinetic kinds of terrorism or the murder of civilians to cause all kinds of other sorts of harms, psychological harms and those sorts. And I would regard those on par with terrorism.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, and I had a question to tag on then. So some forms of fabrication are impermissible depending on the purpose. Some forms of truth are impermissible. So then what's the proper response to impermissible social media acts? So I think that gets into your last chapter of your book on justified responses.
Well, I mean, again, it depends on I suppose on the harm done. I mean, the whole problem of soft war is is there intra-domain retaliation? In other words, can a cyber attack be met by media warfare? Can a prisoner issue be met by a course of diplomacy or sanctions? And when it comes to cyber, very often people want to keep things within their domain. I don't necessarily see that that's an issue here. I mean, you could say that, well, one side lies or the other side lies, but I don't necessarily see that that's that kind of tit for tat. I mean, depending on the harm done through media manipulation, certainly other forms of retaliation could be forthcoming. So, especially when the use is unlawful. So if you had a situation like the Second Intifada, where the use of propaganda clearly triggered terrorism or incited towards terrorism, one response might be to attack those sources of dissemination, which could be attacks on media outlets, on television stations, which of course was done. My argument has always been that those are not quite military targets, so they should be disabled in certain ways before lethal force is used. But I mean, that issue came up when NATO bombed Libyan television back in 2010, when NATO invaded Libya. The United Nations said it was a direct assault against a protected object. NATO came back and said, no, they're disseminating all kinds of information, most of it false. But regardless, it was used to kind of incite the people to rise up against the government, to rise up against NATO troops. And under those circumstances, they responded with kinetic force to destroy these radio and TV stations. So there is interdomain, I think, room for interdomain reaction here.
Yeah. Well, I mean, but can a permissible response to an impermissible social media act be lethal? Can you actually, not only go like between domains, but also kind of push up into the lethal arena of responding?
Well, this was my point. I mean, if you had a situation, and it would be an extreme case because people are becoming much more savvy now with social media.
Yeah.
And it's being used in ways that could they can modulate it and kind of throttle back as needed. But if you had an extreme situation where a government or a sub-state group or some hacker organization was using social media to incite violence,
exactly.
then perhaps I think you absolutely could.
Yeah, okay, right. Thank you. I see David Luban's screen on. David, did you have a question?
No, I didn't have my hand up with a question.
Oh, okay. Let's see. Well, I had a question for then Tami. So then ultimately, is the status of an unlawful combatant, I mean, are they a criminal? Is that a fair word to apply to them?
No, not as I understand it, and I'm sure David can help me here. But no, first of all, I don't like the term unlawful combatant. I use it, but I use it sort of because that's the term that's used. I much prefer the term irregulars, which was always accepted. My understanding of unlawful combatancy is that it's a lack of status. It's not a crime. I don't think that you can be, picked up in France for being an unlawful combatant in Israel and tried at The Hague. It's not a war crime, but it's a lack of status. And absent the immunities that combatant status grant you, most things that your most violent acts are going to be criminal, at least according to domestic law.
Mm-hmm. Good. Okay. Anyone else? I see Uwe on screen. Uwe, did you have a question?
Yes, a question to Tama. It seems to me you want to base basically the idea that hostage taking should not be allowed by the law in the case of irregular fighters on the moral premise that this is basically always wrong if they are taken as hostages. Now, a very simple speculative question. Suppose some irregular group, Jewish militant fighters in the Second World War, would have managed to take Rudolf Höss, the commander of Auschwitz, as hostage, and would have successfully negotiated the release of the inmates of Auschwitz and free passage to Argentina. Would you think this kind of hostage taking would have been impermissible?
It would have been illegal. That doesn't mean that I would have thought that in this rare example, it couldn't be morally justified, but it would still be illegal. I'm not asking questions about, is there no case? I even ask these questions, okay? Even with a child, let's say that you could have captured, one of the Goebbels' children and held him hostage and vied for the release of 10,000 concentration camp prisoners. Yes, I might think that in that rare case, there's a moral justification to act illegally, but that's not the question that I'm asking. I'm asking whether the bias of the laws of war, whether the prohibition on hostage taking, not only in the laws of war, also in domestic law and so forth, is justified. And I think it is justified. Does that mean there's no unusual case that might be morally justified? No, it doesn't mean that.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, I think the revisionists, by the way, whom Uwe loves, they make this distinction between eliminative and opportunistic killing, right? And I think that seems to be the, a distinction that you're applying to this situation, Tami.
Well, yeah, well, what I call, or my basic problem with revisionism here has to do with that it will all depend on just cause. But yeah, I suppose you could say that. Yeah, the difference between posing a threat or stopping a threat, and yeah.
A question from Biba. Go ahead. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, Beba, thank you so much. And thank you. Yeah, no, thank you. And thank you both for the awesome presentations. I have a question for Dr. Gross. I think I'm still struggling a little bit to understand this distinction between permissibility and truthfulness, and how we might evaluate permissibility without looking at truthfulness. And I was hoping you could clarify a little bit which kinds of purposes seem like they fit very clearly in this permissibility camp, but not in other impermissibility camps. Some of the examples that you mentioned seemed like they had multiple purposes, actually, like, oh, we could conceive of multiple purposes for the kinds of propaganda. So I was just hoping you could speak a little bit to that. Thank you.
Sure, thanks. Thanks for the question. What I had on one of my slides, you can't see it now, but I mentioned the right of perpetrators, or the right of perpetrators in the sense of those who disseminate propaganda, to self-defense. So broadly speaking, anything that allows the use of force for the purposes of self-defense would legitimate propaganda. So, I mean, it's a very broad field, and then you would start whittling it down where things would perhaps not fit in. But if you were to push it, say, in the direction of the things that I eliminated, incitement to terror, incitement to aggression, those things would not be permissible either for the purpose of self-defense. So I think that if you put it into a self-defense kind of category and ask yourself, well, what kinds of force and under what circumstances can a armed group or a state use force for the purposes of self-defense? And then you ask yourself, well, what is the most cost-effective, least violent form of force that they can use, or what is the, in terms of necessity, in other words, what force is necessary to achieve their aims of self-defense, or let's say other defense, humanitarian intervention, then those same goals would legitimate the use of propaganda. And probably more so, because I can think of many more instances where you could use propaganda than you would, say, permit the use of armed force or some other really destructive means to attain self-defense. Does that answer the question? In other words, I'm answering it backwards.
It does. I guess I'm just worried about how restrictive that is. It seems to me like there are lots of instances where we wouldn't want to restrict how a state communicates with its own citizens or citizens of other countries, right?
Okay.
And we might even think that there's a right to receive foreign speech. And so.
Okay, yeah, keep going. I mean, it's gonna, you can start to build it up, but where are you taking it? I mean, is there a specific case in mind, or do you have a set of variables in mind that would be problematic in this case?
Yeah, I think what I'm resisting a little bit is the thought that it's only in these narrow set of circumstances that we would consider propaganda permissible. Maybe I need to spend a little bit more time thinking about the cases that you've put forward and this framework.
Oh, I didn't mean to limit it. I mean, I think there's probably many different cases where it would be permissible. I was looking only at the edges, where the cases that I brought, like the Al-Dura case and like the Jenin case, these were cases where they created a lot of outrage because of, well, not the Al-Dura case, but certainly the Jenin case, a lot of outrage because of the manipulation, of the lies. So I took that case as paradigmatic of a case where, yes, it was fabricated, but in the interest of self-defense, it was also permissible, also as a necessary means, as a most cost-effective, least violent means to achieve a legitimate self-defensive aim. So you have to answer all of these questions and check all of these boxes. But propaganda fits in like anything else. I mean, you can look at our other soft war tactics. We ask questions about coercive diplomacy, about sanctions, about blockades, about taking prisoners, and so on and so forth. So clearly the overriding criteria is something that's just self-defense, humanitarian intervention, and so forth. But I think you could flesh it out quite well. I mean, it'd be a really interesting thing to do.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Good question. I have a kind of a smart aleck follow-up then. So in questions where there's been an incitation of violence via social media, does some of the culpability reside on the side of those who are incited? And if so, does that mitigate the response that's permissible?
Those who were incited, you mean those on the receiving end of the propaganda?
Exactly.
Because
I mean, they're agents too, you know, and they could respond unduly or not. I mean, how much of the fault lies with them for the violence that's incited?
against them?
No.
You're talking about the recipients, the people. I see.
Yeah.
I don't know. I've never thought of that. In other words, so if you were to ask, say, for example, in the case of incitement, so if the Aldura, I suppose you could answer this. So if the Aldura clip was used as as incitement, there would certainly be some responsibility to lie with the people who are using it. In other words, as they see that it's inciting people towards terrorism, then they certainly have an obligation to restrain themselves. Now, do other people in the community have an obligation to say something and say, this is wrong, this is object to it in some way? I suppose they would. I mean, just as they would if the army was pursuing other acts of terrorism and aggression.
Well, one would want to say that the recipients of incitement, if there's death that's involved, could respond lethally. But it seems to me that they're somewhat culpable for the fact that violence occurred. I mean, they have a choice about how to respond to the social media that's trying to incite them to violence. And therefore, it's just something to think about. I don't have it fully worked out in my head either, but it just seems like there's a mitigating dimension to the fact that there are agents on both sides.
And the fact that people choose to be
incited. Yeah.
That's a real, I guess I haven't given it any thought. I imagine there's a psychological mechanism there you could pry open. And kind of see where agency occurs on the part of the affected.
Yeah, exactly.
Person.
So for example, I'm Irish and we have anger problems, you know, so
so you're more incitable than, say, I don't know.
That's a genetic thing. We're not
vegetarian. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, just something.
Michael, could I ask a follow-up question? One of the I'm thinking.
Is that David?
Yeah, it is. This is returning to Beba's question about truthful propaganda that you believe, or rather untruthful propaganda that you think is permissible as a self-defensive measure. Do you have to think about the long-term collateral consequences of it? So that if, for example, in the Jenin case, if one of the consequences is that an image of Israelis as indifferent, ruthless, barbaric, and so on sticks in world public opinion because of false propaganda about the casualties inflicted, and maybe incites more anti-Semitism and so on, is that, how does that figure into your questions about the just war theory? I mean, are these collateral consequences, collateral damage that has to be taken in? What is it?
Well, I considered a couple of different collateral or long-term effects. So I mentioned, for example, the costs of lying to the enemy and whether and how it affects the prospects of peace. That issue has been raised, but I've never found any data that would lend weight to concluding that really occurs. I suppose that you could do a couple of things with it. You could classify it as distant collateral harm, downstream collateral harm that is way downstream, that could be taken into account, might have to be discounted, and then you would have to have some idea of what the import was and whether and how that affected how it weighed against the benefits. But that might be unavoidable in some cases. I'm not sure how you would evaluate it. It would certainly be a cost that you'd have to take into account. And it may be an unintended consequence. I mean, I don't know if the Palestinian Authority officials who perpetrated this propaganda, who disseminated this propaganda, who put this spin on it, as it were, we're thinking down the line of how it might affect anti-Semitism. I mean, there were movies that came out of it later on, Janine, for example. So I don't quite know how you would do that, but it would certainly be, if you could, it would be a cost you'd have to take into account and weigh it against the benefits, I would think, no?
David, any follow-up?
No, I mean, just the follow-up that I think somehow one needs to think about the collateral consequences of untruthfulness. You know, I think if it were truthful propaganda, then one lives with the truth.
Right.
One doesn't necessarily live with untruths, but you know, as we all know from people who have had untruths told about them on social media, they do get stuck with them, and those don't go away for a long, long time.
No, it's a good point, David. It's a very good point. I considered long-term effects in terms of lying to compatriots, which I think has to be rectified somewhere down the line. I had not given this particular point any consideration. Maybe it varies on a case-by-case basis. Maybe it's just too difficult to predict, or maybe it's just something inherent in lying, that lies are going to stick. It's a good point.
Yeah, on the collateral damage, it's a great issue. Well, finally, because we're running out of time, midshipmen are going back to class. A question from Duncan McIntosh, who's been waiting for a while, to Tami. Go ahead, Duncan.
Actually, I have a question for both of them. They're both short. First, for Michael, I'm not sure how to apply your criteria in many cases because they seem directly conflicting and not easily ranked. So suppose a terrorist promulgates a truthful beheading video, and their hope is that to their enemies, they'll say, fear me, we're terrifying, give up. And to their sympathizers, join us, we're powerful, we're going to win.
Right.
And you would say that's bad because it's an incitement of terrorist activity and so on.
Well, it's bad. I think the major issue here is in the production of the video.
Well, there's also that. You say if an atrocity is committed in the actual production of the video, that's bad. Now, suppose the people who the terrorists are attacking say, this is amazing, this is wonderful for us, we're going to win now because we can keep rebroadcasting this video as evidence of how horrible the terrorists are. And it's better for us that they actually killed somebody with a beheading doing it. Right. We're going to win. And the message is, join our side, we're humane, resist their side, they're terrible, you know, and you're going to die if you join up with the terrorists. Your criteria say, I guess, use it as a defense against terrorists. Don't use it because it was produced as an atrocity. So how would you rank that?
Well, it's an interesting case because there's all kinds of permutations because the people who are using it aren't the ones who produced it. So I think you have that issue you have to deal with as well. So there's kind of once removed, they've kind of chanced upon it. They're not responsible for producing it. It's out there, they're using it. It's truthful, and they're using it for, say, self-defensive purposes. I would give weight to using it, but then you get back to David's point about long-term effects. Is that going to encourage other people to say, well, I'll make my own snuff film, you know? So there are, and that has nothing to do with the truth now. This has to do with producing social media material in a way that egregiously violates the rights of certain individuals. Does that ever lose that stigma? I don't know. Talking about it now with you, maybe it does. I don't have a clear answer for you. So maybe I'm of two minds as I work my way through it. Maybe it never loses that stigma, and it can never be used, no matter how valuable it might be. But I think that's something that you can never get a definite answer for. You're going to make a decision, and maybe use it, maybe not, based on how you weigh those two factors.
I see what you're saying. You have these factors in play. My question for Tamar, you said there is no objective justification that can be given to the held hostage by a terrorist for bargaining purposes. Did you mean there's nothing that the terrorist could say to respect the person's Kantian agency and talk them into allowing themselves to be a hostage? Or do you mean there's no objective justification that can be given at all for holding this person hostage?
I think I mean the first. I mean, there's no way that you can justify it to the victim. All right. So if you take someone as a prisoner of war, that's unpleasant, it's long and so on, but you say, you know, hey, we have a regime here, you have rights, the option was killing you and so forth. Here, I don't think, I think it's like you blow someone up. You could say, look, we have a just cause. We're trying to free our nation, so we're blowing you up, or we're gouging your eyes out in order to get information. But I wouldn't consider that a justification has to be something where the other person, from their point of view, can feel that he's been taken into account, and this can be justified to him as well. And I think that in all of the cases that we call terrorists, you can't do that.
So in the case of,
I, by the way, think something a little bit similar about lying, Michael, but okay. Manipulating someone, these are deep ways of using them.
so if I capture a soldier, I can say to him, I got to hold you hostage because if I let you go, you'll try to kill me. And you expect him to say, okay, I can respect that. But if I say it again?
I think that a prisoner of war who's treated decently, not necessarily well, decently, can see the advantages of the regime, the advantages for him. He's taken into account in this regime. He has rights. Yeah, I think so.
What if I could talk my hostage into it? You know, I explain our cause. He sees that we got to kidnap a civilian or else we're never going to get anywhere. He wishes it didn't have to be him. He wishes nobody had to die, but he respects our position, hopes release is negotiated, but honestly wouldn't hold it against this guy if he gets killed. Now, would you say, oh, my criterion is correct, and in this case, they're justified. It's okay to keep that hostage.
No, because you're telling me a psychological story, so you've managed to convince him. Okay, but I don't think that you've managed to justify it in any kind of objective sense.
Yeah. So
you can probably, let me give you an example. Let's say you take someone and you enslave them, and you convince them that it's also that, you know, that there's something good about it and you're justified in doing this, or, you know, you have a sex slave. There are all kinds of situations in which you can use a person and you can victimize them even further by convincing them that you're right. That doesn't make it an objective justification.
okay, so your criterion is not, can you appeal to them? Your criterion is, are they justly held or are being justly used? And you would say there is no objective justification for the use of this hostage. I understand now. I think I find that clearer. Thank you so much. And thank you, Ed. Nice to see you again. Nice to see you again, Beba.
You too, Duncan. Thanks for the good question. And we've gone a long time, and we're down to the hardcore believers. Thank you for staying so long. And thank you both, Michael and Tami, for great presentations. I think there's probably
Our pleasure.
2 or 3 papers that are going to come out of this one.
At least.
Yeah. And thanks, Michael.
Thank you, Ed.
Much.
Thanks for doing
Thanks.
it live too, Michael.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Okay. See you tomorrow.